Hi everybody, my name is Dori Collins, and along with you I go to Bethlehem and been here for a long time. I'm excited because you guys are studying the Bible and because Bobby just told me all about your confirmation coming up and you've got this retreat. I really wish I could go with you on the retreat because I love retreats and it's been a while since I've been on one. But today we're going to think about, I was going to say a character, that's because I'm an actor, so I think in terms of characters. We're going to think about the disciple Thomas and the way in which he's often talked about in the scriptures, in the story of the days after Jesus was resurrected from the dead. The disciples were really afraid, and you know what a tumultuous experience that was for them to see their friend massacred before their very eyes, in front of his mother, for things that they loved about him and things that had saved them in their daily life. They were things that Jesus had really reached out and shown them a new way of living, and then he was killed. And killed by some of the hands of their own people, the Jews. So this was just a tremendously, I'm smiling right now because I'm excited for you, but it was really a terrible, terrible time. So you have to kind of work to imagine that. So they were afraid and they were holed up in this room and with the doors shut because they were, as it says in the Bible, afraid of the Jews. And Jesus was crucified on a Friday. He rose again 3 days later on a Sunday. And so it was the beginning of the week, and it was the evening of the beginning of the week that the disciples, and that we understand that to include men and women, were locked in this room, and Jesus appeared to them, even though they had the doors locked. Whoa, there's Jesus. Now they had known that he wasn't in the tomb anymore, that there had been witnesses to his resurrection, but it was still all very confusing and very frightful. And there he is in the midst of them. And the first thing you'll notice in the Bible, anytime a being like an angel or a messenger that God has sent, and in this case Jesus, is in the presence of we humans, the first thing they do is say, "Don't be afraid," or "Peace be with you." And that's what Jesus says. He says, "Peace be with you." So when we share the peace on Sunday mornings, look how old that phrase is. So Jesus appears, and everybody who hadn't been witnesses to the empty tomb now could see for themselves what the women had said, and what Peter had said was really true, that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Now we tend to understand that he was in kind of a holy form, that he was in a transfigured form compared to the way he was when he was with them in the human flesh on earth. And you guys can talk about that some other time. I'm not going to dwell on that. But there he is. So Thomas was not there. He had something else going on that night. He was not in the room. So his fellow disciples, the men and women that he had been ministering with, said, "Guess what? Jesus appeared to us. He was right there. He really is risen from the dead." And Thomas says, "Well, okay, but unless I can touch the places where the nails went through his hands, and unless I can put my hand in his side," because you might remember that Jesus' side was pierced with a spear by one of the soldiers. "Unless I can put my hand in that wound, I'm not so sure." And here's the interesting thing. Throughout history, and many, many generations of the Bible being interpreted, and I might say misinterpreted sometimes, Thomas has kind of gotten a bad rep. He's gotten a bad reputation. And he's often called Doubting Thomas. And I don't know, is there a difference between doubting and wanting to make sure? You know, that's kind of an interesting question. But I digress. The story goes on. A week later, they were still afraid. They'd still been holed up in that room. Thomas is with them this time. Jesus appears again, offers them peace, and offers his wounds in his side. And Thomas literally touches his wounds and touches his side. And of course, understands that Jesus has been raised from the dead. And Jesus says an interesting thing. He says, talking to Thomas, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now, it's really interesting in our culture. We can take that word blessed and equalize it to the word better. Better are you. It's not. That does not mean that. Better, if Jesus says, "Have you believed because you have not seen?" Better are those who have believed who have not seen. That's not what that means. Blessed is when God's love is infused in us in a way that's life-sustaining. So could it be that Jesus was not saying, well, you had to see me to believe, but, better are those who can even believe without seeing? Or is Jesus saying, you saw me and you believed, and also those who don't see me can also be blessed, can have an infusion of can experience the infusion of my love. Some interesting things come to my mind when I think about this story and about Thomas's bad reputation for being a doubter. You and I are loved by a God that was wounded. And I don't want to put, stories in your mouth about your own life, but it's, I think, a fairly safe thing for me to say that we all experience pain in life. And it can be surprising to us. We can go through a patch in life where all of a sudden we have a lot of pain. I'll tell you one, in my own life, my father is ailing, and I've had to make a lot of trips to Indiana to help take care of him. And I just said to my sister the other day, this is really hard for me. The work of taking care of him is hard. That's what she thought I meant. But really it's because life is changing. And I was not expecting that. And that's been painful. It feels like a wound. So we have wounds that we experience from time to time, some deeper than others. We are loved by a God who was wounded, who understands our wounds. And to me, the cool thing about Thomas is not that he was doubting, but that he knew Christ relationally. It was the mark of a relationship that he wanted to make sure that is this the person that I used to dine with and that I listened to and that I learned from. I know one way that I can tell, through the wounds. So he related to Jesus based on his wounds, and so can we, as well as on many other things that you could talk about, in your discussion, the ways in which you relate to God, or that God relates to us, and then we learn to relate to God. But anyway, back to wounds and Thomas. Here's another kind of cool thought. It occurred to me that because we're in relationship with God, we have ways of knowing, ways of telling. That's an important thing to think about and to talk about, and just to live, a question to live with. What are the ways in my life that I can be certain or be sure that it's really God that I'm relating to, and not something that's not of God, And so one of the things I take away from this story is that we have ways of knowing God. So as you do your work and as you prepare for your confirmation is kind of a way of standing up and saying, I know how I know God. And I have these various ways that God has given me through community, through God's Word, through the physical things that God has given us, bread, communion bread, and wine, and the water of baptism. Think about it, those things are available all over the world on a pretty much daily basis in most cultures. And God has given these things that are sustained by the very earth, that are ways of knowing God. So that's another takeaway that I have from this story, that we have ways of knowing God that have been given to us by God. And those are things to celebrate, and not to diss by saying, oh, well, you had to be sure, or you doubted. No, I know how I know God, and I want to be sure. I want to live in that. I want to celebrate. I want to touch my Lord. I wish I could be part of your discussions, but if you see me around church, just stop me and tell me how things went. I hope we can meet sometime soon.